One aspect of Dragon's Rising Season 3 was that we were reintroduced very briefly to the concept of the Oni, and the thing is that since the Oni have been within the show, a lot has happened in terms of the show's lore. And when you take the new lore of the show into consideration, you realize that the Oni are actually a lot more than you may potentially realize, as there has been some details that we have recently seen that gives me an impression that we have had the complete wrong impression of the Oni from the Oni trilogy. And I do think it is fairly interesting, because if what I am now believing is to be the case, I believe that the Oni are completely different to what we initially realized. And more specifically, the Oni that we have seen within the show, or more specifically in March of the Oni, may not be the full story. Because in my opinion, those Oni weren't exactly the real Oni, or more specifically, not the full-fledged of the Oni army. But bear with me as I explain my theory. We need to track back first to what we have had established about the Oni. Of course, we have been led to believe until now that the Oni were just simple manifestations of darkness and destruction. They are the dark side of the Oni and the dragon, the two original species in all of the 16 realms. And that for the most part was completely fine to me. I never really thought too much more of the Oni, because apart from Omega and Mistake, we weren't really shown Oni to really be all that intelligent. They were for the most part just demons, and that was basically all they were meant to be. But like I said, it feels like it is definitely different now. Because the thing is that in Season 3 of Dragon's Rising, we were introduced to the Dragonian Warriors, a fairly powerful race of dragon-like species. It is no question that they fall on the dragon side of the Oni and the dragon. But the thing is that since they were introduced to us, it feels like it has definitely called into question what the Oni were that we actually got to see in March of the Oni. And this is where my theory officially comes into place. I feel like the Oni army that we saw in March of the Oni wasn't exactly what we were told that the Oni were. It feels like they were the equivalent essentially of the Dragonians. It feels like those were meant to match up to each other, and there was something more to the Oni army. And I'm gonna be honest, there's a lot to back this up. There were two main things that have come to mind when it does come to the idea that the Oni army from Season 10 is the equivalent of the Dragonian Warriors. The first thing is the fact that even though Doc has confirmed that the Omega is the equivalent to Thunderfang in the military sense, he doesn't actually state that they are the same in the balance sense. I feel like a lot of people have considered that they're both the same type of being from this comment, when in reality, all Doc necessarily says is that they both held the same position within their respective army, which doesn't equate to them being at the same actual level. And to be honest, it makes more sense to me, because it makes more sense to believe that Omega is more in line with Tia. Because that's the thing, Omega is essentially Tia in a lot of ways, a very smaller based army under the Dragon and the Oni that was not exactly as powerful, but definitely there. More on this later, but the thing is that you will realize that Omega does line up perfectly when it does come to Tia. And not to mention, you gotta remember that Tia, also the name stands for the God of War. It makes more sense to understand that Omega would be the equivalent of the literal God of War. The other thing that stuck out to me again is from Season 3, and it's a particular scene that I do find interesting. It is the scene where we get to see Rogue handing off a Oni chalice in return for a payment. And the thing that also struck me is the fact that Oni chalices exist. The thing is that some sort of fine pottery, some sort of fine, exquisite art piece from the Oni army doesn't exactly make a lot of sense. Like I said, the Oni army for the most part just seemed to be a bunch of mindless demons. They didn't exactly seem to be all that intelligent. And again, it calls into question where something like a chalice could actually come from. It just brings up this whole idea that the Oni in reality were a lot more civilized than you could actually realize. But again, it doesn't match up at all with Season 10. If anything, it's a direct contradiction. So the thing is that it makes sense to believe that there was something more when it does come to the Oni. And that is again where the theory truly begins. So for this theory, I'm essentially going to completely reformat and restructure the Oni species and make them more in line with what we know nowadays, especially in comparison to the dragons. And I'm going to be honest, these details go as far back as Season 8, so it does feel like there was more to it than we actually realized even then. At the top of the Oni species is actually going to be what a very common theory is when it does come to the Oni, and that is the equivalent of the Source Dragons being the Source Oni. Of course, it has been stated that anything is possible when it does come to the Source Oni, even though it's not been outright confirmed. But it would make sense to believe that there is a source for all the darkness and destruction, and that would be where it did come from, because again, it comes down to the balance. But with the Source Oni there, you would have to have what is the equivalent of the Arc Dragons. Remember, that is what Thunderfang was. Thunderfang wasn't just a regular dragon. He wasn't just something that anyone and everyone could have been. He was a high-ranking officer in the army of the dragons, and he was fairly powerful at that. And again, there has to be an equal and opposite to something like Thunderfang. So I'm not going to introduce Arc Oni. I'm not going to do anything like that, but I am suggesting that there is something of the equivalence of Thunderfang, and more specifically, the Arc Dragon. And again, you may be thinking that we've had no reason to believe that something like that would exist. And for one, like I said, there has to be something because of the balance. And I don't think it's Omega, so it has to be something else. But the thing is that the show itself has actually implied that there is something of that equivalence. And again, it's from Season 8 and from the Oni Mistake herself. In Season 8, where we get to see Mistake explain to Lloyd and Jay about the story of the Oni and the dragon, of course you get to see a depiction of the dragon and the Oni side by side, and in this depiction you do actually get to see the two of them at the equivalent of each other. The Oni looks very different in Mistake's illustration, but the thing is, there's no one more accurate to what the Oni look like than Mistake. So if this illustration is to be believed, you would also have to believe that there are Oni type beings that are at the size of the Arc Dragons, or more specifically, just at the size of the dragons in general. So what if, by all accounts, it seems to be that there is something larger with the Oni specifically, and that is what would be the equivalent of Thunderfang. So I will say, even though I don't want to call them Arc Oni, for the sake of it, I will refer to them as such. Because we've got the very top, which is the Source Oni, next up which is the Arc Oni, and then there is one more tier in my opinion. And that to me, by all accounts, would just be a regular Oni that isn't the Oni that we saw in Season 10. I think there is 4 tiers on an overall, and this tier that's between Omega's army and what would be an Arc Oni would essentially be the more civilized depiction of the Oni army. You would have them be the ones who make the chalices and the pottery and all the markings that we've also seen in Season 3. They would be the more civilized nature of the actual Oni army, and that would make it so there is 4 tiers of Oni in very similar vein to the dragons, because like I said, with the dragons you had the Source Dragons, the Arc Dragons, the regular dragons that we see quite commonly in Ninjago, and now the Dragonians. And if you think about it in terms of the balance, it would make sense that the Oni also has those structures. This idea to me really does clean up what we've been learning about the Oni in Season 3. It explains their more sophisticated history. It explains why Omega's army seemed to be a lot more mindless. Because the thing is that it just doesn't make sense to me if you consider the Oni just being this one singular army that was also weirdly capable of being fully civilized. I'm not saying this means the Dragonians aren't civilized, because they very clearly are. But what I'm saying is that there has to be an equal and an opposite. And just because the Oni army are just mindless demons doesn't mean the Dragonians also have to be. It's just the case that they balance each other out in terms of their power. The thing is as well is that I have mentioned the idea of balance multiple times, and I've always tried to take balance into consideration with a lot of my Dragon's Rising theories, and it just simply makes sense to believe that this would be the case, because otherwise you would have a situation where the Oni were facing up with beings like Thunderfang, and I'm gonna be perfectly honest, it just doesn't seem to be the case that Thunderfang would have been able to have been defeated by what we saw in Season 10. To put it in a funny way as well, this would also give them the perfect opportunity to actually bring the Oni back. There have been a lot of implications in Dragon's Rising that would suggest the Oni are going to return. Of course, there is no confirmation of their return, but if they wanted to go down this angle and have this kind of idea for a new army, or more specifically just have the Oni back in the story in some way, this would definitely be the way to do it in my opinion, because not only would you be able to introduce much larger scale Oni and much more powerful Oni, you would be able to bring them back without having to justify the Oni army that got atomized in Season 10. And I do think beyond anything else, this would be a great way to just re-establish the Oni as a lot more fierce army. They went down fairly easily in Season 10, and I do think there was a lot more potential when it did come to the Oni, and it would make them much more than just mindless beings. It would give the Oni some more intelligence, it would give the Oni a lot more of an interesting backstory, and it would make it so there is more to them than what meets the eye. And I think that is a fantastic idea, because we're talking about a race of species that were one of the first, and meant to be one of the most powerful, and I do think this restructured idea would be a fantastic way of really establishing them as the original threats. But I do think on an overall this theory does have a lot of ground. If it's not true, I honestly wouldn't be surprised, but I do honestly believe that this could be the case. And I'm gonna be honest, I do think there are a lot more to the Oni than has met the eye before now, and I do believe all the details that we have seen and the ones that I have picked up on have to matter in some way, because Mustake herself has been shown that the Oni could be more, and the thing is that we have got the idea that the Oni could be this much larger being and could face up more to the dragons in a lot of different ways. But like I said, I just think it could be wrong, but I don't believe it is. But this is where I'm going to pass off this theory to you guys. I would love to know your thoughts, because I do think this idea would completely recontextualize what we do know about the Oni, and I do think for the better, because it would just make the Oni so much more interested and give them so much more than we initially realized in a lot of different ways, because it does make sense to believe that they would be more of the equivalent of the dragon, because as it stands, there is all these different types of dragon and all these different sources of power when it comes to the dragon, and then you've just got this one little army of Oni that got completely atomized by the tornado of creation. But I do want to know what you think. But above all else, I hope you enjoyed the theory, and I hope you enjoyed the video. I honestly love doing a deep dive on the Oni. It's given me a whole new appreciation for them, and I hope it did for you as well. And if there are any other species or locations you want to see me deep dive, please let me know in the comments down below, because I love it, and I do like to help recontextualize what we know about Ninjago so far. And if you did enjoy the video, please consider subscribing. It's honestly really fun to just have more people to discuss Ninjago with. I love it so much. And if you do want to support the channel further, which you don't have to, you could consider becoming a channel member. You could even join the Eternal Legends, such as Grandmaster Sensei 28208, or Dareth for short. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed the video like I said, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Take care. Okay, bye!